can achieve their goals, whether those goals are economic or political or social or cultural or spiritual or whatever. Okay, there is a course on economic statecraft. The Institute of World Politics, of course, is an institute that is an educational body, an institution of higher learning that concentrates on statecraft. As such, it is unique. It is unique in the United States. For all I know, it may be unique in the world. What is statecraft? Statecraft is the employment of the instruments of state power for the achievement of the foreign policy goals of that state. So that economic statecraft is the employment of the economic instruments of state power for the achievement of the goals, the foreign policy goals of the state. There are a number of other elements of state power. But before going into that, let me talk about the international system a little bit. The international system is changing before our very eyes in a way which makes it more complex and more difficult to deal with. The so-called Westphalian system, the nation-state system that developed following the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War, is now coming to its end. It'll probably take a long time, but countries are now only one of many actors in international politics, international relations. Economic actors, particularly the great corporations, act as if country boundaries didn't exist any longer. Only when they have to do they pay attention to them. Same thing is true of the great financial institutions, the great banks, insurance companies, and so on. Same thing is true of non-governmental organizations. Particularly, let's say, take as an example environmental non-governmental organizations, environmental NGOs, who pay no attention to country boundaries, country frontiers. Criminal syndicates. Country frontiers are simply annoyances, something to be ignored, or to simply be pierced, to be gotten through with a minimum cost. Terrorist and liberation organizations, subversive organizations of all kinds, know no frontiers. All of these are actors now in international relations. They interact with each other. They interact with other non-governmental organizations. They interact with other actors in the international scene, and they interact with countries. And countries interact with them. And they have to, and they have no choice but to do that, whether they like it or not. And so far, they've been very bad at doing it. This is not surprising. This is a relatively new development. Nevertheless, it behooves the governments of the countries of the world to devote a lot more time and attention to the way that they deal with these other entities, and to form the instruments of policy making and the instruments of policy implementation that will permit them to effectively do so. So that the instruments of statecraft are not only employed by governments, they're employed by all these other institutions. International organizations operate very much as if country frontiers didn't exist. The United Nations, the Arab League, the European Union, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, etc., etc. Even though their members are countries. What are the areas of foreign policy? What does it mean when you talk about a country's foreign policies? What are the different types of foreign policy? Well, first of all, there's diplomacy, which is basically simply international negotiation. And going from the least violent to the most violent. Next you have propaganda, which is the attempt to convince other countries that what you're doing is right and what they're doing perhaps is wrong, and that they ought to support what you want to do. Thirdly is economic strategies of all kinds, which we will go into very briefly in a moment. Fourthly, subversion, that is attempting to subvert the institutions of the other country. Military display, that is doing the same thing that a dog does when it growls or a cat does when it hisses, and ranging from marches to mobilization on another country's frontier, and war, which is the most violent form of statecraft. So, economic statecraft. It comes in two flavors, negative and positive. Negative economic statecraft are attempts to punish another country for taking actions that you don't like. And that also comes in two flavors, trade sanctions and financial sanctions. Ever since the beginning of history, countries have taken trade sanctions against each other. They've been called various things. But since the 20th century, trade sanctions have become extremely common. Not a year goes by without new trade sanctions being employed, and the old trade sanctions sometimes are eliminated. But there are many trade sanctions that have been applied by countries, by groups of countries, and by international organizations such as the United Nations. Earlier, the League of Nations in the interwar period. Trade sanctions for various reasons, which we don't have time to go into, are not very effective and are actually, in many cases, the motivation is not really to change the behavior of the other country, but to convince your own people that you're doing, quote-unquote, something about the problem. If the people demand that you do something more than simply talk, more than rhetoric and diplomacy, well, there's always economic sanctions, particularly trade sanctions. Trade sanctions are easy to evade, they're very hard to apply. There are many reasons why they don't work very well. You can count the times that they can be said to have affected seriously the policies of another country. Can be counted on the fingers of one hand, and the application of trade sanctions is in the hundreds, if not the thousands, over the last century. Financial sanctions are the attempt to sanction another country in terms of its financial transactions. Now, it has various advantages over trade sanctions. One is that there's a relatively few number of countries that can apply it effectively, and those are the countries that have large capital markets, United States, Japan, Great Britain, 3 or 4 others. In other words, if a foreign country is forbidden, or a foreign entity, such as a bank, is forbidden to access the financial markets of the United States, that is an important sanction. That is an effective sanction. At the present time, we have a very interesting experiment going on, which is the application of both trade and financial sanctions to Iran to try to get it to change its mind about developing nuclear weapons. And the trade sanctions have been quite unsuccessful. The financial sanctions have been quite successful. They have hurt the Iranian economy. That's been shown by various analyses quite substantially. Whether it will be sufficient to cause Iran to abandon its attempt to develop nuclear weapons is another story, which remains to be seen. But it certainly has created a good deal of economic disruption in Iran, and a good deal of popular unrest, which can be considered to be of great importance. The other types of economic actions that can be taken are positive. Incidentally, there are other negative measures that can be taken, but they're relatively rare, and we won't go into them today. But we will mention the 2 major categories of positive measures. And these are measures to try to convince other countries through economic measures to support our foreign policy goals, rather than to punish other countries because they don't support our foreign policy goals or are taking actions that we are opposed to. And again, they come in 2 flavors. The first is what is usually called foreign aid. Now, the libraries that aren't filled with books on economic development are filled with books on foreign aid. Foreign aid is not very successful in helping other countries develop economically. There are a lot of reasons for that. One reason being that a lot of it is stolen. Why is it that massive corruption in countries which receive large amounts of foreign aid is not particularly seriously attacked by the countries providing that aid? It's a very simple answer, because that's not why the aid is given. The aid is given in order to convince the government of the other country to support your foreign policy goals. And if that means that the people in that government are going to steal money and put it in the Swiss bank accounts, that's just fine. If they don't, if they actually apply the funds for economic development, wonderful. But one thing that will do, of course, will be to interfere with the financial markets of the country and with the productive process of the country, because the local entities will be under competition from outside entities, which will make their job of creating economic development and economic growth that much more difficult. Foreign aid does not, by and large, assist other countries in developing more rapidly. It can be a very effective instrument of economic statecraft. But that's because it's an instrument of statecraft and has a foreign policy goal and reason for being, not because it has anything to do with actual economic development. There is one exception. There is one important exception. Aid that is given without having any kind of political motivation. And that is aid provided because of natural disasters in other countries and other regions of the world. Earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, volcanoes, and droughts, floods, and so on and so forth. There is aid given, humanitarian assistance, by countries, by governments, as well as by private entities in those cases, and that is given without foreign policy considerations. All other forms of so-called foreign aid are really transfer payments made to other countries to buy their support. And that doesn't require a library full of publications. The other form of positive economic statecraft is the signing of trade agreements with other countries. And they range from, as we've seen, trade facilitation agreements to free trade agreements, customs unions, and common markets. There's a very interesting aspect about this element of economic statecraft, and that is, it is the only element of economic statecraft. It's the only sector of economic statecraft which is actually to the benefit of the economic situation and the social, and therefore the social situation in the countries involved, as well as to the world in general. It's the only aspect of economic statecraft that is to the benefit of all the countries involved, as well as to the benefit of the world as a whole, because it adds to the quantum of wealth being produced by important elements of the world society. All the other elements of economic statecraft are negative for economic growth. If they are negative for development, they are negative for the relationships among countries from the economic standpoint, although they may be positive from the political standpoint, the foreign policy standpoint. Let me leave you with two thoughts because of the kinds of positions that you're likely to occupy in your future life. One is that without the proper information, economic statecraft cannot be properly engaged in with any chance of success except by pure chance. That's also true of the other elements of statecraft, but they're particularly true for economic statecraft. In other words, economic intelligence is extremely important. When Bill Casey took over the CIA in 1981, one of the first things he did was fire the entire economic staff and replace it. These are the economic analysts who had been saying that the Soviet Union is developing economically at a very rapid rate, and they've been saying that for years. Based on statistics, that number one were highly questionable, and number two didn't make any sense anyway, because they were on the basis of saying, well, in year X, steel production went up 15% over the previous year, but we didn't know what the previous year was, so it's 15% over what, and they were probably lying anyhow. So what these analysts did would take the last year when you actually had a figure, which could have been in 1947, and apply the percentages that were announced every year thereafter, and they came up with this gigantic amount of production, whereby in steel production alone they could have covered the entire world with steel plates. This was, of course, absolute nonsense, but this was the stuff that the CIA was putting out to the policymakers on the economic side. It's relatively easy to get good economic intelligence. that doesn't mean that we get it, but it's relatively easy to get it because a lot of it can be done from space and from the air. You can look at how drought-ridden areas are being affected, how crops are coming along, what factories are going up and what factories are closing down, and transportation links and so on. You can use a lot of technological intelligence in terms of the economy. Human intelligence is also, of course, extremely important, but it's less important than in some of the other areas of statecraft. But if you don't have it, you're not going to be successful in using economic statecraft or any form of statecraft. That's one point that needs to be made. The second point that needs to be made, and then that you need to keep in mind in terms of your future careers, is that the economic elements of international relations are becoming more and more important with the passage of time. It behooves you and your colleagues to understand and have a basic understanding of economics, of international economics, and of economic statecraft. Again, I want to wish you all the best of wonderful luck and happiness and prosperity in your future careers. I hope to be talking to a number of you in the course on economic statecraft next semester. I apologize for the problems that we had at the beginning of this course because of using distance learning techniques for the first time. We're going to be devoting the next 6 weeks before the spring semester starts in trying to make the process more interactive during the actual class period, which is the big lack, or has been the big lack up to this point, and I'm sure that you would agree with that. If you want to communicate with me with reference to distance learning in general, and particularly if any of you are experts in that area or have a good deal of knowledge in that area, or with the people at the Institute who are working on this, particularly Professor Waller, I'm sure we would be delighted to hear from you. In the meantime, happy landings and good luck and the best of good fortune to all of you. Thank you very much.